When a wounded stranger collapsed by her doorstep, she didn't hesitate. Day and night, she cared for him, feeding, bandaging, and praying he'd live. To her, he was just a lost soul caught in the storm. But when he finally rode away, she never expected to see him again. Until one morning, a carriage arrived, carrying a man dressed in wealth and gratitude. The stranger she'd saved had returned, to give her the life she'd only dreamed of. The horse appeared first, a shadow lunging through curtains of snow so thick the world had gone white. Its hooves pounded the frozen earth in rhythm with thunder that had no sky to fall from. The rider slumped forward, one hand tangled in the mane, the other hanging limp at his side. Blood traced a dark line down the animal's flank, black against the pale coat, steaming in the cold. The cabin sat alone at the edge of the valley, a single window glowing like a coal in the dark. Inside, the woman stood at the stove, stirring beans that had long since softened. She didn't hear the hooves at first. The wind had been howling for hours, rattling the shutters, moaning through the eaves like something alive and angry. But when the horse screamed, she froze. The spoon clattered into the pot. She turned toward the door, her breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat. The lantern on the table flickered. Outside, the storm roared louder, as if trying to drown out whatever had just arrived. The woman's hand moved to the rifle propped beside the doorframe. Her fingers wrapped around the stock, worn smooth by years of gripping but never firing. She hadn't needed to shoot anything in a long time. Out here, trouble usually announced itself with words first. But tonight, there were no words. Only the sound of something heavy sliding off a saddle and hitting the porch with a dull, terrible thud. She waited. The wind screamed. The fire popped behind her. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Then, silence. Not the kind that came with peace. The kind that came when something had stopped breathing. She crossed the room in 3 strides and pressed her ear to the door. Wood creaked beneath her boots. The wind clawed at the frame. She heard nothing else. No footsteps, no voices, no groaning. Just the storm, wild and relentless, like it had been sent to erase whatever had just been delivered to her threshold. Her hand trembled as she lifted the latch. The door swung inward, and the cold hit her like a fist. Snow whipped into the cabin, biting her cheeks, stinging her eyes. She raised the rifle and stepped out onto the porch, squinting into the white chaos. The horse stood a few feet away, sides heaving, reins dragging in the snow. Its eyes rolled white with panic, and at her feet, sprawled across the weathered boards, lay a man. He wasn't moving. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and thick, spreading slowly toward the edge of the porch where it would drip into the snow and vanish. His coat was torn open at the shoulder, the fabric stiff with frozen blood. His hat had fallen somewhere in the storm. His face, what she could see of it, was pale as death, lips cracked and blue, eyes shut tight against the cold or the pain or both. She lowered the rifle. For a moment she just stood there, the wind tearing at her hair, snow piling on her shoulders. She looked at him, this stranger, this man she didn't know and hadn't asked for, and felt the weight of a decision she hadn't wanted to make. Out here you didn't open your door to just anyone. Out here kindness could get you killed, but leaving him would be the same as pulling the trigger herself. She set the rifle down and crouched beside him. Her hands hovered over his chest, unsure where to touch, where to begin. His breathing was shallow, barely there, each exhale a thin wisp of vapor that the wind stole before it could rise. "Can you hear me?" she said, her voice lost in the storm. No answer. She gripped him under the arms and pulled. He was heavier than she expected, dead weight, muscle and bone and soaked wool. Her boots slipped on the icy boards. She braced herself and dragged him backward, inch by inch, toward the open door. The snow tried to bury him. The wind tried to steal him back. She didn't let it. Inside, the fire crackled, warm and indifferent. She hauled him across the threshold and kicked the door shut with her heel. The cabin fell quiet again, the storm muffled behind thick walls. She stood there for a moment, gasping, her arms burning, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack a rib. The man lay on her floor, bleeding onto the rug she'd braided herself 5 winters ago. His chest rose and fell, barely, like a candle flame in a draft. She didn't waste time. She dragged him closer to the fire, rolled him onto his back, and peeled away his coat. The shirt beneath was soaked through, stiff with ice and blood. She grabbed her sewing scissors from the table and cut it open, fabric falling away to reveal a body marked by violence and survival. Scars crisscrossed his ribs, old wounds, long healed. But the fresh one, high on his shoulder, still bled. She pressed a towel against it and held firm. Blood seeped through the cloth, warm against her palms. She couldn't tell if it was a bullet wound or a knife, couldn't tell if it had gone clean through or lodged itself somewhere deep. All she knew was that if she didn't stop the bleeding, he'd be dead by morning. She worked in silence, the way she always had. No prayers, no panic, just hands that knew how to stitch and clean and hold pressure until the bleeding slowed. She'd done this before, not for a man, but for a calf once, caught on barbed wire. And for her son, years ago, when he'd fallen from the barn loft and split his head open. That memory came and went like a shadow. She blinked it away and focused on the stranger. By the time she'd cleaned the wound and wrapped it with strips torn from an old sheet, the night had deepened. The fire burned low. The beans on the stove had gone cold. She sat back on her heels, her hands stained red, her breath coming slow and steady now. The man's face had regained a flicker of color. His breathing evened out, no longer rattling in his chest. She watched him for a long time, studying the lines of his face, the stubble along his jaw, the furrow between his brows, the way his mouth hung slightly open, as if he'd been about to say something before the pain took him under. He looked older than she'd first thought, somewhere in his 30s maybe, hard to tell with men like him, men who lived rough, slept under stars, and wore their years like scars. She didn't know his name, didn't know where he'd come from or who'd hurt him, didn't know if he was running towards something or away from it, but she knew one thing: he was hers to care for now, whether she wanted him or not. She stood, her knees stiff and aching, and fetched a blanket from the chest by the window. She draped it over him, tucking it around his shoulders, and then stepped back. The cabin felt smaller with him in it, crowded somehow, even though he took up no more space than a sleeping dog. Outside, the storm began to ease. The wind died to a whisper. Snow fell softer now, drifting instead of driving. The world beyond her walls grew still, as if holding its breath. She moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The valley stretched out before her, white and endless, glowing faintly under a sliver of moon that had finally broken through the clouds. The horse stood near the porch, head low, steam rising from its back. It hadn't run. It had stayed. That meant something. She let the curtain fall and turned back to the man on her floor. He hadn't moved, hadn't woken, but his chest rose and fell, steady now, and that was enough. She pulled a chair close to the fire and sat down, the rifle across her lap. She didn't plan to sleep, not tonight, not with a stranger bleeding in her house and no way to know what dawn might bring. The fire popped, the wind whispered, the man breathed, and the woman who had lived alone for so long, who had buried hope and built walls around her heart, found herself whispering a prayer she hadn't spoken in years. "Lord, if you're still listening," she said quietly, her voice barely louder than the flames, "let this one live. Just this once." She didn't know why. She said it, didn't know why it mattered, but the words hung in the air, fragile and small, like the first green shoot pushing through snow. Outside, the storm cleared. The land fell silent, and somewhere deep in the dark something shifted, not in the world but in her. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by the fire, watching the stranger's chest rise and fall, and wondered what kind of man the storm had carried to her door. By morning, the sky had turned pale and cold, the color of old bone. Snow lay smooth and untouched across the valley, erasing every trail, every track, every sign that anything had ever passed through. The world looked new, clean, as if the storm had wiped the slate and offered something fragile in its place, a chance maybe, or a reckoning. The woman stood at the window, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone lukewarm. She hadn't touched it. Hadn't moved from the spot since dawn crept through the curtains. Behind her, the man still lay by the fire, silent and still, wrapped in the blanket she'd given him hours ago. She turned and looked at him. His face had softened in the light, the sharp lines of pain smoothed by sleep, but his body was a map of violence, scars layered over scars, muscle carved lean by hunger and hard riding. His hands, calloused and rough, lay open at his sides, palms up, as if surrendering to something unseen. She walked over and crouched beside him. His breathing was steady now, deep and even. The bandage on his shoulder had bled through once during the night, but she'd changed it, and the wound seemed to be holding. No fever yet. That was good. Fever meant infection, and infection out here meant death more often than not. She reached out, hesitated, then pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. Cool, no sweat. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. His eyes opened. She jerked back, her heart leaping into her throat. For a moment, neither of them moved. He stared at her, his gaze unfocused, clouded with confusion and pain. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He blinked, slow and deliberate, as if trying to pull the world back into shape. "Easy," she said, her voice low and steady. "Safe." He didn't seem to hear her. His eyes darted around the room, the fire, the walls, the window, the door. His hand twitched toward his side, searching for something that wasn't there. "Your gun's over there," she said, nodding toward the table where she'd set his revolver after pulling it from his holster. Unloaded. His gaze snapped to hers. For a second she saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or anger. But then it faded, replaced by exhaustion so deep it looked like drowning. He let his head fall back against the floor and closed his eyes. "Where am I?" he rasped, his voice rough as gravel. "My home," she said simply. "How'd I— Your horse brought you—" He was quiet for a long moment. When he opened his eyes again, they were clearer, sharper. He studied her face, his expression unreadable. "You pull me inside?" he asked. She nodded. "Patch me up?" Another nod. He exhaled slowly, his breath trembling. "Why?" She didn't answer right away. She stood and walked to the stove, ladling broth into a bowl. When she came back, she knelt beside him and held the bowl close to his face. "Because you'd have died if I didn't," she said. He looked at the broth, then at her. "Maybe that's what I deserved." "Maybe," she said. "But it's not what you got." She lifted the spoon to his lips. He hesitated, pride warring with need, then opened his mouth and let her feed him. The broth was thin, salted and warm, nothing fancy. But he drank it like it was the first meal he'd had in weeks. When the bowl was empty, she set it aside and sat back on her heels. "What's your name?" she asked. He didn't answer. "All right," she said. "Then I'll call you whatever I want." The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Cole," he said after a moment. "Name's Cole." She nodded. "I'm Ruth." They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the sun climbed higher, pale and distant, casting long shadows across the snow. "Who shot you?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "Doesn't matter. It might if they come looking. They won't." "You sure about that?" He looked at her, his eyes hard and tired. "No." She held his gaze for a moment, then stood and walked to the window. The valley stretched out before her, empty and white. No riders, no smoke, just the wind moving through the pines. But she knew better than to trust stillness. "You can stay till you're strong enough to ride," she said without turning around. "But after that, you're gone." "Understood." She glanced back at him. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. "And if trouble comes because of you," she added, her voice quiet but firm, "you'll handle it, not me." "Fair enough." She turned back to the window, her arms crossed over her chest. The coffee in her mug had gone cold. She poured it out into the snow and watched it sink, dark against the white. Behind her, Cole shifted, wincing as pain lanced through his shoulder. He didn't complain, didn't ask for help, just gritted his teeth and lay back down, staring at the ceiling as if it held answers he couldn't name. And Ruth stood at the window, watching the valley and wondering what kind of storm she'd just invited into her life. But as the morning stretched on, and the light grew stronger, she realized something she hadn't expected. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel so empty. But as the storm cleared and the land fell silent, she realized he hadn't yet decided to stay or to live. The light came slow that first morning, seeping through gaps in the curtains like water through cupped hands. Ruth stood at the stove, stirring oats that had already softened, her movements automatic, her mind elsewhere. The cabin felt different now, the air thicker, the silence louder. She'd lived alone so long that even the sound of another person breathing felt like an intrusion. Cole hadn't moved much since waking. He lay by the fire, eyes half open, watching the flames with the blank stare of a man who'd seen too much and felt too little. His shoulder was bandaged clean, the bleeding stopped, but the wound would take time she wasn't sure either of them had. She ladled the oats into a bowl and crossed the room. Her boots creaked against the floorboards, the same boards she'd walked for 8 years, alone, after the fever took her boy and the silence took everything else. "You need to eat," she said, kneeling beside him. He turned his head slowly, like it weighed more than it should. Not hungry, doesn't matter. She lifted the spoon. He stared at it, then at her. Something flickered in his eyes. Stubbornness, maybe, or shame. But he opened his mouth and let her feed him. They didn't speak. The oats went down slow, each spoonful a small battle against pride and pain. When the bowl was empty, she set it aside and stood. "I'll check the wound after you rest," she said. "Don't need rest. You need more than you think." He didn't argue. Just closed his eyes and let the exhaustion pull him under. Ruth watched him for a moment, then turned and walked to the door. She pulled on her coat, wrapped a shawl over her shoulders, and stepped outside into the cold. The world had gone still. Snow covered everything: the porch, the path, the fence posts that marked the edge of her land. The sun hung low and pale, offering light but no warmth. Her breath plumed in front of her face as she walked toward the barn, her boots crunching through the crust of ice. The chickens scattered when she opened the coop, clucking and fussing like old women at church. She scattered feed across the ground and watched them peck, their heads bobbing in frantic rhythm. Simple creatures, predictable. Nothing like the man lying on her floor. She collected the eggs, 3 of them, still warm, tucked them into her apron, and moved on to the woodpile. Her hands worked without thought, splitting kindling, stacking logs, carrying armfuls back to the house. The work kept her steady, always had. When she came back inside, Cole was awake again. He'd managed to prop himself up against the wall, his face tight with pain but his eyes clearer than before. "You shouldn't be sitting," she said, dropping the wood beside the stove. "Can't lie down forever. You can for now." He looked at her, something like amusement crossing his face. "You always this stubborn? Only when people try to die in my house." She hung her coat on the peg and moved to the stove, building up the fire. The warmth spread slowly, pushing back the cold that had crept in while the door was open. "Where's your husband?" Cole asked suddenly. Ruth's hands stilled. She didn't turn around. "Dead," she said. "I'm sorry. Don't be. You didn't know him." She resumed her work, breaking the eggs into a pan, the sound of sizzling fat filling the silence. Cole didn't press. Didn't ask how or when or why. She appreciated that. They ate in quiet, her at the table, him on the floor by the fire. The eggs were plain, salted but nothing more. She didn't have butter. Didn't have much of anything except flour and beans and the chickens that gave her just enough to survive. When the meal was done, she cleared the plates and poured water from the pitcher into a basin. She carried it over to Cole and set it down beside him. "I need to clean the wound," she said. He nodded and started to pull his shirt off, wincing as the fabric tugged at the bandage. She helped him, her hands careful and impersonal, the way a doctor's might be. But when the shirt fell away and she saw the full map of scars across his chest and back, she paused. Knife wounds, bullet holes, burns that had healed crooked. Some old, some older. A life written in violence. "What kind of man are you?" she asked quietly. He looked down at himself, then back at her. "The kind that survives." She didn't respond, just unwrapped the bandage and began cleaning the wound with a cloth dipped in whiskey. He hissed through his teeth but didn't pull away. "This is going to scar," she said. "Figured, you've got enough already." "Yeah." She worked in silence, dabbing away dried blood, checking for infection. The wound was clean, ragged, but clean. Whatever had hit him had gone through, which meant no bullet to dig out. That was lucky. Out here, luck was the difference between living and dying. When she finished, she wrapped fresh bandages around his shoulder and tied them off. He sat still through all of it, his jaw tight, his breathing controlled. "Thank you," he said when she was done. She nodded and stood, carrying the basin to the door to dump the water into the snow. When she came back inside, he was staring at the fire again, his expression distant. "You don't have to tell me what happened," Ruth said, sitting down at the table. "But if someone's coming for you, I need to know." Cole was quiet for a long time. The fire popped, wind whispered against the walls. "I rode for a man," he said finally. "Big rancher. Thought I was doing honest work. Turned out he wasn't honest and neither was the work. So you left, tried to, and he didn't take kindly to it." Ruth leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "So someone shot you for quitting, more or less. They know where you are." "No, I made sure of that." "You sure?" He looked at her, his eyes hard. "As sure as I can be." She held his gaze, searching for the lie. but all she saw was exhaustion and something deeper, regret maybe, or shame. "All right," she said. "Then you rest, you heal, and you go. That's the plan." She stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside. The valley lay empty, the snow unbroken. Nothing moved except the wind through the pines. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. The days folded into each other, slow and quiet. Cole slept most of the first week, waking only to eat and let Ruth change his bandages. She moved around him like he was part of the furniture, present but not intrusive. She had her routines, and she kept them. Feed the chickens, chop the wood, mend what needed mending. She didn't talk much, and neither did he. But the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came when two people understood that words weren't always necessary. On the 8th day, Cole stood for the first time. Ruth was outside when it happened, hanging laundry on the line strung between two posts. The wind snapped the sheets like sails, and she fought to pin them down, her fingers numb with cold. When she came back inside, he was on his feet, leaning against the wall, his face pale but determined. "What are you doing?" she asked, setting down the basket. "Standing." "I can see that. Sit down before you fall. I've been lying down for over a week, and you'll be lying down longer if you tear that wound open." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something like a smile pull at the corner of his mouth. "You're worse than a schoolmarm, and you're worse than a stubborn mule." He laughed, a short, quiet sound, and it startled both of them. Ruth turned away quickly, busying herself with folding the laundry, but she felt something shift in the room. Something small and fragile, like the first thaw after a long winter. By the second week, Cole could walk without leaning on the walls. His strength came back slowly, but it came. Ruth watched him move around the cabin, testing his limits, and she said nothing. She'd learned long ago that some men needed to prove themselves, even when no one was asking. One morning she found him outside, standing by the fence, staring out at the valley. Snow still covered the ground, but the sun was warmer now, the light sharper. Spring was coming, slow but certain. She walked up beside him, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "What are you looking at?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." She followed his gaze. The land stretched out before them, wide and empty, the kind of emptiness that could swallow a person whole if they weren't careful. "You miss it?" she asked. "Riding, I mean." He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes. But mostly I miss the parts that came before. Before what? Before I knew better." She didn't ask what he meant. She thought she already knew. They stood there together, two people who'd lived too long with ghosts, and watched the valley breathe. That night, Ruth sat at the table writing a letter she'd never send. She'd written dozens of them over the years, letters to her son, to her husband, to God when she still believed he listened. She didn't know why she kept writing them. Maybe because it was the only way to keep the past from disappearing completely. Cole sat by the fire, whittling a piece of wood he'd found in the kindling pile. The knife moved slow and careful, shaving off thin curls that fell to the floor like snow. "Who are you writing to?" he asked without looking up. Ruth paused, her pen hovering over the paper. "No one." "Then why write it?" "Because I need to." He nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "I used to do that. Write things down, I mean. Letters I never sent. Stopped after a while. Felt like talking to the dead." "Maybe that's all any of us are doing," Ruth said quietly. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before. Recognition. Like he'd found someone who understood a language no one else spoke. She folded the letter and set it aside. "What are you making?" she asked, nodding toward the wood in his hands. "Don't know yet. Just letting it tell me." She smiled faintly. "That's a strange way to carve. It's the only way that works." They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling between them, the wind sighing outside. And for the first time in years, Ruth realized she didn't mind the company. By the third week, Cole was strong enough to help. He started small, carrying water from the well, splitting kindling, feeding the chickens while Ruth worked on mending the fence. She didn't ask him to. He just did it. One afternoon, she found him in the barn, hammering a loose board back into place. His shoulder was still wrapped, but the bandage was smaller now, the wound healing clean. "You don't have to do that," she said from the doorway. "I know. Then why are you?" He set down the hammer and looked at her. "Because you helped me when you didn't have to. Seems only fair I return the favor." She didn't know what to say to that. so she nodded and walked back to the house. But that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she thought about fairness and debts and the way kindness sometimes carried weight neither person expected. The fourth week brought warmer days. Snow melted into mud, and the first green shoots began to push through the earth. The valley woke slowly, shedding winter like an old coat. Cole worked alongside Ruth now, their days falling into rhythm. Chores in the morning, repairs in the afternoon, quiet evenings by the fire. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. The work spoke for them. One evening, as the sun bled red across the hills, Ruth stood on the porch watching the light fade. Cole came up beside her, wiping his hands on a rag. "Thank you," he said. She glanced at him. "For what? For not giving up on me?" She looked back at the valley, her arms crossed. "I didn't do it for you, I know, but I'm grateful anyway." They stood there as the last light drained from the sky, and Ruth felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not quite hope, but close. Close enough that it scared her, because hope, in her experience, always came with a price. And as the stars began to prick the darkening sky, she wondered what the cost would be this time. Inside, the fire burned low. The cabin settled into night, and somewhere beyond the valley, in towns and trails they couldn't see, the world kept turning, carrying with it the shadows Cole had tried to outrun. But when his strength returned, so did the shadows in his eyes, and the truth she feared might follow him home. The morning came soft, the kind that didn't announce itself with cold or wind, but simply arrived, patient and inevitable. Ruth woke to the sound of the axe biting wood, a steady rhythm that pulled her from sleep before the sun had fully cleared the hills. She lay still for a moment, listening, then rose and dressed in the dim light. When she stepped outside, Cole was at the woodpile, his shirt damp with sweat despite the cool air. The bandage was gone now, replaced by a pink scar that pulled tight across his shoulder when he swung the axe. He'd been at it a while. The split logs were stacked waist-high beside him. She didn't say anything, just walked past him toward the chicken coop, carrying the feed bucket. The hens scattered and clucked, their small bodies bustling with the urgency of creatures who believed every meal might be their last. By the time she'd collected the eggs and checked the fence line, Cole had finished with the wood. He was carrying an armload toward the house when she met him on the path. "You'll pull that shoulder if you're not careful," she said. "It's fine." "It's not. But you'll do what you want anyway." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "You always this concerned about people you barely know? Only the ones stubborn enough to hurt themselves twice." The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but close. He walked past her toward the house, and she followed, the eggs cradled in her apron. Inside, the cabin smelled of coffee and wood smoke. Ruth set the eggs on the counter and moved to the stove, where the pot was already heating. Cole had learned where things were, how she kept the fire, when to add water. He hadn't asked permission, he'd just done it. She cracked 3 eggs into the pan, the whites sizzling as they hit the heat. Cole stacked the wood beside the hearth, then washed his hands in the basin. The water turned dark with dirt and bark. They ate at the table, the morning light slanting through the window and catching the dust that hung in the air. The eggs were simple, the bread day-old, but it was enough. Out here, enough was all anyone could hope for. "Fence on the east side's coming loose," Cole said, wiping his plate with the last of the bread. "Posts are rotted through, needs replacing before the cattle start wandering." Ruth looked up. "I don't have cattle. You should. Land like this, you could run a small herd. Enough to sell in town come fall." "I don't go to town." He set down his fork. "Why not?" She stood and carried her plate to the basin, her back to him. "Because I don't." He didn't press, just nodded and finished his coffee. But later, as Ruth stood at the window watching the clouds build over the far ridge, she thought about what he'd said. Cattle, town, a future that looked different than the one she'd been living. She hadn't thought about the future in a long time. The days stretched longer now. The sun stayed high, and the air warmed enough that Ruth could leave the door open while she worked inside. She spent the afternoons mending clothes, shirts and trousers worn thin at the elbows and knees, seams that had split and needed restitching. Her hands moved with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, the needle dipping in and out, the thread pulling tight. Cole worked outside, repairing the fence line he'd mentioned. She watched him sometimes through the window, the way he moved, careful and deliberate, testing each post before driving it into the ground. He didn't rush, didn't cut corners. The work mattered to him, even though it wasn't his land. One afternoon, she brought him water. He was kneeling in the dirt, hammering a post into place, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. When she approached, he looked up and took the cup without a word. "You don't have to do all this," she said. He drank, then handed the cup back. "I know. Then why?" He looked out at the valley, his eyes narrowing against the light. "Because it needs doing. And because I owe you more than I can repay. You don't owe me anything." "That's not true," she wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't pride or stubbornness. It was something quieter, something like gratitude mixed with guilt. She turned and walked back to the house, the empty cup in her hand, and tried not to think about what it meant that he was still here. Evening fell slow and golden. Ruth stood on the porch, a basket of laundry at her feet, pinning sheets to the line. The wind tugged at the fabric, and she fought to hold it steady, the wooden pins clutched between her teeth. Cole came around the side of the house carrying a bucket of nails. He set it down and reached up to hold the corner of the sheet while she pinned it. "Thank you," she said around the pins. He didn't answer, just held the fabric until she was done, then moved to the next one. They worked together in silence, the sun sinking lower, the light turning the world soft and amber. When the last sheet was hung, Ruth stepped back and looked at the line, white fabric snapping in the breeze like sails on a ship she'd never seen. "My mother used to say laundry on the line was the closest thing to prayer," she said quietly. Cole looked at her. "You believe that?" "I don't know what I believe anymore." He nodded slowly, as if he understood. "Me neither." They stood there as the light faded, two people who'd lost their faith in different ways, and watched the sheets billow and settle in the wind. That night, Ruth sat at the table with a lamp burning low, writing another letter she'd never send. The words came slow, each one pulled from a place deep inside her that she didn't visit often. "I think about you every day. Wonder what you'd look like now. Wonder if you'd recognize me. I've gotten older. Harder, maybe. Or maybe just tired. But today I hung laundry with a stranger, and for a moment I didn't feel so alone. Does that make me weak? Or just human?" She set the pen down and stared at the page. The ink was still wet, the words dark against the pale paper. She didn't know why she kept writing these letters, didn't know who they were for anymore. Across the room, Cole sat by the fire, whittling the same piece of wood he'd been working on for weeks. It was taking shape now, something smooth and curved, like the body of a bird. "What is it?" Ruth asked, nodding toward the carving. He held it up, turning it in the firelight. "A wren. Least I think it is. Hard to tell till it's done." "Why a wren?" He was quiet for a moment, the knife still in his hand. "My mother used to say wrens were brave. Little things but loud, always singing even in the cold." Ruth watched him, the firelight catching the lines of his face. "She sounds like she was kind." She was. For a while he didn't elaborate, and Ruth didn't ask. Some stories didn't need telling. She folded the letter and tucked it into the drawer with the others. Then she sat back and let the silence settle around them, warm and easy, like an old quilt. The days turned to weeks, and the weeks turned to something neither of them named. The work became routine. Mornings spent on chores, afternoons on repairs, evenings by the fire. They moved around each other with the practiced ease of people who'd learned each other's rhythms, who knew when to speak and when to stay quiet. One morning, Ruth woke to the sound of hammering. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Cole on the roof of the barn, replacing shingles that had blown off in the winter storms. His shirt was tied around his waist, his skin bronzed by the sun. "You're going to fall," she called up. "Not planning on it. Plans don't mean much when you're 20 feet off the ground." He looked down at her, shading his eyes with one hand. "You want me to stop?" She opened her mouth to say yes, then closed it. He was careful. She could see that. And the barn needed fixing. "Just don't die," she said finally. "I'm tired of patching people up." He grinned, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and went back to work. Ruth walked to the garden, where the first green shoots were pushing through the earth. She knelt in the dirt and began pulling weeds, her hands moving slow and methodical. The soil was cool and damp, rich with the smell of thaw. She'd planted this garden every spring since she'd come to the valley. Some years it flourished, some years it barely survived. But she planted it anyway, because giving up felt like dying. Behind her, the hammering continued, steady and sure. That afternoon, they worked together on the fence line. Cole dug the post holes while Ruth held the new posts steady. The sun beat down and sweat soaked through their clothes. They didn't talk much. The work took all their breath. But when their hands brushed, reaching for the same hammer, Ruth felt something spark between them. She pulled back quickly, her cheeks warm. Cole didn't say anything, just handed her the hammer and moved to the next post. But the air felt different after that, charged somehow, like the moment before a storm. Evening came, and with it the kind of quiet that made the world feel small. Ruth sat on the porch steps, a cup of coffee cooling in her hands. Cole sat beside her, his elbows on his knees, his hat pushed back on his head. "This is good land," he said after a while. "It's stubborn land. Takes more than it gives. That's most land." She glanced at him. "You miss it? Ranching, I mean, sometimes. But mostly I miss the idea of it. The way it felt before I knew what it cost. What did it cost?" He was quiet for a long time. The sun slipped below the hills and the first stars began to prick the sky. "Everything," he said finally. Ruth didn't know what to say to that, so she sipped her coffee and watched the darkness settle over the valley. "I buried my son out there," she said quietly, nodding toward the rise beyond the garden. 5 years ago. Fever took him in 3 days. He was 8. Cole turned to look at her, his face shadowed. "I'm sorry. Everyone says that. But sorry doesn't bring him back. No, it doesn't." They sat in silence, the weight of their losses hanging between them like smoke. "His name was Samuel," Ruth said. "He loved horses. Used to beg me to let him ride, even though we only had the one old mare. I'd tell him when he was older. When he was bigger." Her voice cracked and she stopped. Cole reached out slowly, his hand covering hers where it rested on the step. He didn't say anything, didn't try to fix it. Just sat there, his hand warm and steady, and let her grief breathe. After a while, she pulled her hand away and stood. "I'm going to bed." He nodded. "Good night, Ruth." She walked inside and closed the door behind her, but as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she could still feel the warmth of his hand on hers, and she didn't know if that terrified her or comforted her. The next morning, she woke to the smell of bacon frying. She dressed and came downstairs to find Cole at the stove, flipping strips of meat in the pan. "Where'd you get bacon?" she asked. "Found it in the cellar, smoked and wrapped. Figured you'd been saving it." For what?" She didn't have an answer. He plated the bacon alongside scrambled eggs and set it on the table. They ate together, the food rich and salty, better than anything she'd had in months. "Thank you," she said when they were done. "You're welcome." She looked at him across the table, this man who'd arrived half dead and bleeding, and realized she didn't want him to leave. The thought scared her more than the storm that brought him. But as the days turned warmer and the valley bloomed green and wild, Ruth found herself laughing for the first time in years. It happened without warning. Cole said something about the chickens acting like old gossips, and the sound just spilled out of her, bright and unexpected. He stared at her, surprised, and then he laughed too. The sound filled the cabin, chasing out the ghosts that had lived there too long. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wildflowers and new grass. The land stretched wide and forgiving beneath the endless sky. And for a moment, just a moment, Ruth let herself believe that peace might last. But peace, in this country, never lasts long, and the first sign of smoke rose before supper. The smoke came from the east, thin and gray against the pale evening sky. Ruth saw it first while hanging the wash, her hands stilling on the clothespin as her eyes tracked the dark line rising above the ridge. It wasn't the smoke of a campfire or a chimney. It was too wide, too deliberate. The kind that came with purpose. Cole stepped out of the barn, a coil of rope over his shoulder. He followed her gaze and his whole body went rigid. "How far?" he asked, his voice low. 3 miles. Maybe less." He dropped the rope and walked to the edge of the porch, his eyes narrowing as he studied the sky. The smoke was moving, not spreading, but traveling, coming closer. "Riders," he said. Ruth's stomach tightened. "You sure?" "I'm sure." She didn't ask how he knew. The look on his face told her everything. This wasn't the first time he'd seen trouble coming. "Go inside," he said. "Get the rifle." She wanted to argue, wanted to say this was her land and she'd face whatever came. But the edge in his voice stopped her. She went inside, pulled the rifle from above the door, and checked the chamber, loaded. Her hands didn't shake, but her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might crack a rib. When she came back out, Cole was standing in the yard, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. He'd strapped it on that morning for the first time since he'd arrived. Said he was going to clean it, check the action. Now she wondered if he'd known. The smoke drew closer. And then, through the trees at the far end of the valley, they came. 5 riders moving slow and steady, their horses dark shapes against the fading light. They rode in a line, shoulder to shoulder, the way men did when they wanted to be seen, wanted to be feared. Ruth stepped up beside Cole, the rifle held low but ready. You know them? No. But they know me. The riders stopped at the edge of her property. Just beyond the fence line Cole had spent weeks repairing. They didn't dismount, just sat there, letting the silence stretch, letting the threat settle in the air like dust. The man in the center leaned forward in his saddle. He was older than the others, broad-shouldered and hard-faced, with a beard gone gray and eyes that looked like they'd forgotten how to soften. "You Cole Brennan?" he called out. Cole didn't move. "Who's asking?" "Name's Taggart. I ride for Samuel Gaines." Ruth felt Cole go still beside her. The name meant something bad. "Don't know him," Cole said evenly. Taggart smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's funny, because he sure as hell knows you. Says you stole from him. Says you ran off with money that wasn't yours. He's a liar, maybe. But he's a liar with a lot of land and a lot of men. And right now he wants what you took. I didn't take anything. Then why'd you run?" Cole's jaw tightened. "Because men like him don't care about the truth. They care about what they can take." Taggart leaned back in his saddle, his hand resting on the pommel, close to his gun. "Well, that may be, but you're still going to have to answer for it. You can come with us now, peaceful like, or we can make this hard. I'm not going anywhere." The other riders shifted, hands drifting toward their holsters. Ruth raised the rifle, the barrel leveling at Taggart's chest. "This is my land," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "And you're not welcome on it." Taggart's eyes slid to her, cold and appraising. "This your woman, Brennan? She's got nothing to do with this." That didn't answer my question. "She's someone you're going to leave alone." Taggart studied them both for a long moment, then spat into the dirt. "You're making a mistake, Brennan. Gaines doesn't forget. And he doesn't forgive. Then he and I have something in common." Taggart's smile faded. He pulled his reins, turning his horse. "You've got till sundown tomorrow. After that, we come back. And when we do, we won't be asking nice." The riders turned and moved back the way they'd come, slow and unhurried, their message delivered. Ruth watched them until they disappeared into the trees, her hands aching from gripping the rifle too tight. When they were gone, Cole exhaled slowly and turned to her. "I need to leave," he said. "No, Ruth. No." She lowered the rifle and looked at him, her eyes hard. "You leave now, they'll just come back. And next time, they won't care that you're gone. They won't hurt you if I'm not here." "You don't know that." He stepped closer, his face tight with frustration and something else. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "I won't let you get hurt because of me." "Then don't leave." She held his gaze, her voice firm. "Stay, and we'll figure this out together. There's nothing to figure out. These men don't negotiate, they take, then let them try." Cole stared at her, something shifting in his expression. "You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. I've spent 5 years alone, waiting to die. I'm not doing that anymore." The words hung between them, raw and true. Cole's hand lifted, hesitated, then settled on her shoulder. "You're braver than you should be," he said quietly. "Or more foolish. Maybe both," she almost smiled. But the weight of what was coming pressed down too hard. That night, neither of them slept. Ruth sat at the table, cleaning the rifle, checking the action, counting the bullets. 12 rounds. Not enough if it came to a fight, but enough to make a point. Cole stood at the window, watching the valley. The moon was up, casting silver light across the snow that still clung to the shadowed places. Everything looked peaceful, but peace was a lie now. "Tell me the truth," Ruth said without looking up. "What did you do?" Cole was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and tired. "I worked for Gaines for 2 years. Rode herd, moved cattle, did whatever he asked. He paid well, paid better than anyone else in the territory. I didn't ask questions. And one night I found out why. He was rustling cattle from smaller ranches, changing the brands, selling them as his own. I confronted him, told him I wanted out, What did he say? He said I knew too much. Said if I left, he'd make sure I didn't talk. Ruth looked up. So you ran. I tried, but his men caught up to me on the trail. They shot me, left me for dead. He turned from the window, his eyes dark. Your storm saved my life, and now they think you stole from him. It's easier to call me a thief than admit what he really is. Ruth set the rifle down and stood. Then we tell the truth. We go to the sheriff. The sheriff works for Gaines. Half the town does. No one's going to believe. Me over him. Then what do we do? Cole looked at her, and she saw the weight of it in his eyes, the knowledge that there was no good answer, no clean way out. We wait, he said, and we hope they don't come back. But hope, Ruth had learned, was a fragile thing. The next day crawled by like a wounded animal. Ruth went through her chores with mechanical precision, feeding the chickens, checking the garden, mending a tear in her skirt. But her hands trembled, and every sound made her heart jump. Cole stayed close, his rifle always within reach. He checked the fence line, the barn, the approaches to the house. He was preparing for a siege, and they both knew it. By mid-afternoon, the first riders appeared. Not 5 this time, 10. They came from the east again, but this time they didn't stop at the fence. They rode straight into the yard, their horses kicking up dust, their faces set hard and cold. Taggart was at the front, and beside him rode a man Ruth had never seen, tall and lean, dressed in a black coat that looked too fine for ranch work. His face was sharp, his eyes pale and calculating. Samuel Gaines. Ruth stepped onto the porch, the rifle in her hands. Cole stood beside her, his revolver already drawn. Gaines looked at the house, at the woman with the gun, at the man who dared to cross him. Then he smiled. Cole Brennan, he said, his voice smooth as oil. You're a hard man to kill, not for lack of trying. Gaines dismounted slowly, his movements unhurried and deliberate. I'm a reasonable man, Cole. You know that. All I want is what's mine. I don't have anything of yours. You have knowledge, you have information that could damage me. That makes you mine. I'm not your property. Gaines's smile didn't waver. No. But you're a problem, and I don't leave problems unsolved. Ruth stepped forward, the rifle rising. You're on my land, and I'm telling you to leave. Gaines turned his cold eyes on her. Who are you? The woman who's about to shoot you if you don't get off my property. For a moment, something flickered in Gaines's expression. Surprise, maybe, or amusement. Then it was gone. You're protecting a thief, ma'am. A man who stole from me and ran like a coward. He's not a thief, and you're a liar. The words hung in the air, sharp and dangerous. The riders shifted in their saddles. Taggart's hand moved toward his gun. Gaines held up one hand, stopping them. Careful, ma'am. You're making accusations you can't prove. Then prove me wrong. Ride into town. Stand before the people and tell them what you do. Tell them where your cattle really come from. Gaines' jaw tightened. You don't know what you're talking about. I know enough. He stared at her for a long moment, his pale eyes cold as winter. Then he turned to Cole. You have until dawn, he said quietly. Leave this valley and never come back. If you do, I'll let her live. If you don't, he let the threat hang, unfinished. No, Ruth said. Gaines looked at her. This isn't your fight. It is now. He studied her, his expression unreadable. Then he mounted his horse and pulled the reins. Dawn, he said. Choose wisely. The riders turned and rode out, slow and menacing, their shadows long in the afternoon light. When they were gone, Ruth lowered the rifle, her arms shaking. Cole holstered his gun and turned to her. You shouldn't have done that. Someone had to. They'll come back, Ruth, and next time they'll burn this place to the ground. Let them try. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip firm but not rough. I won't let you die for me, and I won't let you run for him. They stood there, face to face, breathing hard, the weight of what they'd just done pressing down like a stone. Why? Cole asked quietly. Why are you doing this? Ruth looked at him, this man who'd come to her broken and bleeding, who'd worked her land and fixed her fences and made her laugh for the first time in years. And she realized the answer was simple. Because you stayed, she said. When you could have run, when you should have run, you stayed, and you helped me. And I'm not going to abandon you now. Cole's eyes softened. His hand lifted, his fingers brushing her cheek, rough and gentle at the same time. You're going to get yourself killed, he said. Maybe. But I'd rather die standing than live on my knees. He almost smiled. Then he pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, and she let herself lean into him just for a moment, feeling the steady beat of his heart against hers. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of smoke and dust. The valley stretched wide and empty, waiting for whatever dawn would bring. And in the small cabin at the edge of the world, two people who'd lived too long alone held each other and prepared for war. That night, they made their plans. Cole checked every gun, every bullet, every possible approach to the house. Ruth filled buckets with water in case of fire, hid food in the cellar, barricaded the windows. They worked in silence, the weight of what was coming making words feel useless. When everything was ready, they sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. Ruth's hands were folded in her lap, her eyes distant. "I'm not afraid," she said quietly. Cole looked at her. "You should be. I've been afraid for 5 years. I'm tired of it." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen. Ruth, no." She squeezed his hand, her voice firm. "We're going to survive this, both of us. And when it's over, we're going to rebuild. We're going to live." Cole looked at her, and something in his expression cracked open. "I don't deserve you. That's not for you to decide." He pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I won't let them hurt you. I swear it. I know." They sat there as the fire burned down, holding each other in the darkness, two souls bound by mercy and stubbornness, and something neither of them dared name yet. Outside, the night deepened. Stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the valley, riders waited for dawn. But Ruth and Cole didn't sleep. They held each other and watched the darkness, ready to fight for the fragile peace they'd built, ready to stand no matter the cost. When he rode away before dawn, he left behind more than footprints. He left her the courage she'd need to follow. The horse was gone before the first light touched the horizon. Ruth knew it the moment she woke. The barn was too quiet, the air too still. She threw off the blanket and ran outside barefoot, her nightgown catching on the rough boards of the porch. The barn door stood open, swinging gently in the pre-dawn breeze. Cole's saddle was missing, his saddlebags, his rifle, gone. She stood in the doorway, her breath clouding in the cold air, staring at the empty stall where her mare should have been. He'd taken her horse, the only one she had, the one she hadn't ridden since Samuel died, the one she'd kept out of memory rather than need. On the workbench, folded beneath a stone, was a piece of paper. Her hands shook as she picked it up, the words written in Cole's rough, careful script. "I won't bring this war to your door. You gave me life when I had none. I won't repay that by getting you killed. Forgive me for the horse. Forgive me for leaving. You deserve better than what I can give you. See." Ruth read it twice, then crumpled it in her fist. Rage and grief tangled in her chest, so tight she couldn't breathe. He'd promised. He'd held her last night and promised they'd face this together. And then he'd left her anyway. She walked back into the house, the paper still clutched in her hand, and sat at the table. The cabin felt enormous suddenly, the walls pushing back, the silence thick and suffocating. She'd been alone for 5 years. She knew how to be alone. But this was different. This was the kind of alone that came after someone left, after warmth had filled the spaces and then been ripped away. She smoothed the paper on the table and read it again. "Forgive me." "No," she said aloud, her voice hard in the empty room. "No, I don't think I will." She stood and went to the chest at the foot of her bed. Beneath the quilts and winter clothes, wrapped in oilcloth, was the dress she'd worn when she married. She hadn't looked at it in years. Beneath that, at the very bottom, was her husband's gun belt, the leather cracked but still strong, the holster empty. She took it out and buckled it around her waist. It hung loose. She'd lost weight since he died, since grief had carved her down to bone and sinew, but it would hold. She found the small revolver in the drawer, the one her husband had given her the day they'd moved to the valley. Just in case, he'd said. She checked the cylinder. 4 bullets. She had 8 more in a tin above the stove. 12 bullets total. It would have to be enough. She dressed quickly. Trousers instead of a skirt. Her husband's old shirt. Boots that had been patched so many times the original leather was mostly memory. She braided her hair tight and pinned it up, then pulled on her coat. The sun was rising now, pale and cold, turning the valley silver. Ruth stood on the porch and looked east, toward the ridge where Cole had ridden. She had no horse, no way to follow quickly. But she knew where he was going. He was riding toward Gaines, toward the men who wanted him dead. He was riding toward his execution, and he thought he was doing it for her. Fool, she muttered. Then she locked the door, hid the key under the loose board on the porch, and started walking. The town was 8 miles away. If Cole had ridden hard, he might already be there. But the mare was old, not built for speed. She'd carried Ruth through grief and winter, patient and slow. Cole would be pacing her, trying to make her last. That gave Ruth time. She walked the road she hadn't traveled in years, the dirt rutted from rain and wagon wheels. The sun climbed higher, warming her back but offering no comfort. Her legs burned, her feet ached in the old boots. But she didn't stop. By midday, she'd covered half the distance. Her canteen was empty, her throat dry as dust. She stopped at a creek that ran beside the road and knelt to drink. The water so cold it hurt her teeth. As she wiped her mouth, she heard the sound of wheels creaking. A wagon came around the bend, pulled by 2 tired mules. An old man sat on the bench, his face weathered as driftwood. He pulled the mules to a stop and looked down at her. "You lost, ma'am?" Ruth stood, wiping her hands on her trousers. "No, just walking." The old man's eyes flicked to the gun on her hip, then back to her face. "That's a long walk in boots like those. I'll manage." He studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the back of the wagon. "I'm headed to town. You're welcome to ride if you want." Ruth hesitated. She didn't know this man, didn't know him trust, but her feet were bleeding and the sun was high. Pride wouldn't get her to Cole any faster. "Thank you," she said and climbed into the back. The wagon lurched forward, and Ruth settled among sacks of grain and coils of rope. The old man didn't ask questions, and she didn't offer answers. They rode in silence, the mules plodding steady and slow, the wheels grinding over stones. As they crested the final hill, the town came into view, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single dirt street. The church steeple rose above the rest, its white paint peeling like old skin. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Horses stood tied to hitching posts, their heads low, and in the center of the street, surrounded by a crowd, stood Cole. Ruth's heart stopped. She jumped from the wagon before it fully stopped, hitting the ground hard and stumbling. The old man called after her, but she didn't hear him. She pushed through the crowd, elbowing past men in dusty coats and women with shawls pulled tight. Cole stood in the middle of the street, his hands raised, Gaines's men surrounding him in a loose circle. Taggart was there, and Gaines himself, sitting on his horse like a king surveying his kingdom. The town sheriff stood off to the side, arms crossed, his star catching the sunlight. He wasn't intervening, wasn't even pretending to. "Cole Brennan," Gaines said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "You're accused of theft and desertion. You rode for me, took my money, and ran. That's a debt that needs paying." Cole's jaw was tight, his eyes hard. "I didn't steal anything. I left because I wouldn't be part of what you do. And what is it you think I do? You steal from honest men. Change brands, sell cattle that aren't yours." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Gaines's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. "That's a serious accusation," he said softly. "You have proof?" "I have what I saw. The word of a thief and a coward." Gaines turned to the crowd. "This man took from me. He owes me, and I intend to collect." Ruth broke through the front of the crowd, her breath ragged, her hand on the revolver at her hip. "He's not a thief," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Every head turned. Cole's eyes went wide. "Ruth, no, he's not a thief," she repeated, louder now, stepping into the circle. "And you're a liar." Gaines looked at her, his expression unreadable. "This is the second time you've called me that, ma'am. I don't take kindly to it." "I don't care what you take kindly to. You run this town like you own it. You pay the sheriff to look the other way while you steal and threaten and destroy. But you don't own the truth." The crowd shifted, uncomfortable. A few people looked away, but some held her gaze, their expressions uncertain. "You have proof of these claims?" Gaines asked, his voice dangerously soft. "I have his word, and that's worth more than yours." "The word of a criminal? The word of a man who's worked my land, fixed my fences, and never asked for anything in return. A man who could have run a dozen times but stayed because he's not afraid of the truth." Gaines leaned forward in his saddle. "And what truth is that?" Ruth turned to the crowd, her voice steady and clear. "That Samuel Gaines is a rustler, that he steals cattle from small ranchers and sells them as his own, that he pays men to keep quiet and threatens anyone who won't, and that Cole Brennan left because he wouldn't be part of it." The murmurs grew louder. A woman near the back whispered to her husband, A man Ruth recognized, a small rancher from the North Valley, stepped forward. "I lost 20 head last year," he said quietly. "Found them 3 months later with Gaines's brand." Another voice spoke up. "I lost cattle too. Thought it was wolves." Gaines' jaw tightened. "You're listening to lies." "Then prove it," Ruth said. "Let the sheriff investigate. Let him check your records, your brands, your sales." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Gaines shot him a look that could cut steel. "The sheriff works for the law," Gaines said coldly. "Not for gossip and accusations. The sheriff works for you," Ruth shot back. "Everyone here knows it." A tense silence fell over the street. Gaines stared at Ruth, his pale eyes cold and calculating. Then he dismounted, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. He walked toward her, slow and deliberate, stopping just a few feet away. "You're brave," he said quietly. "Or foolish. I haven't decided which. I don't care what you decide. You should. Because bravery without sense gets people killed." Cole moved between them, his hand on his revolver. "Touch her and you die." Gaines looked at him, then at Ruth, then back at the crowd. He was calculating, weighing his options. The town was watching. People were listening. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. Finally, he stepped back and turned to the sheriff. "Arrest them both," he said. "Theft, slander, and disturbing the peace." The sheriff hesitated. "Mr. Gaines." "Do it." The sheriff's hand moved toward his gun, but he didn't draw. He looked at the crowd, at the faces watching him, and Ruth saw something shift in his expression. "No," the sheriff said quietly. Gaines went very still. "What did you say?" "I said no." The sheriff straightened, his hand falling away from his gun. "I've looked the other way. Long enough. These people deserve better." He reached up and unpinned the star from his chest. It caught the light as he held it out, then let it fall into the dirt at Gaines' feet. "Find yourself another puppet," he said. The crowd erupted. Voices rose, some in anger, some in support. Gaines stood frozen, his face dark with rage. Taggart and the other riders shifted, hands on their guns, but they were outnumbered now. The town was waking up, and they could feel it. Gaines turned to Ruth and Cole, his voice low and venomous. "This isn't over." "Yes," Ruth said. "It is." He stared at her for a long moment, then mounted his horse and pulled the reins hard. The riders followed, and they rode out of town in a cloud of dust and fury. When they were gone, the street fell silent. Then, slowly, people began to move. The rancher who'd spoken up first walked over to Cole and held out his hand. "Thank you," he said. Cole shook it, his expression stunned. Others came forward. An old woman touched Ruth's arm. A man tipped his hat. The murmurs weren't hostile now. They were grateful, uncertain, but grateful. Ruth turned to Cole, her legs suddenly weak. He caught her as she swayed, his arms wrapping around her. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice rough. "You shouldn't have left. I was trying to protect you, and I was trying to save you." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes searching hers. "You're the stubbornest woman I've ever met, and you're the biggest, fool." He almost smiled. Then he leaned down and kissed her, right there in the middle of the street, in front of everyone. When he pulled away, Ruth's cheeks were flushed, her heart pounding. "Let's go home," she said quietly. "Together? Together." They walked out of town side by side, the sun high and warm, the road stretching before them. Behind them, the town buzzed with conversation, with change, with the slow awakening of conscience. And ahead, the valley waited, home and hope and the promise of spring. But dawn found them both bloodied and breathing, staring at a horizon that demanded one final reckoning. The ride back to the valley should have felt like victory. But the silence between Ruth and Cole was heavy with the knowledge that men like Samuel Gaines didn't accept defeat. They adapted, they waited, they came back harder. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had started its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. Cole helped Ruth down from the mare. The old horse had been waiting at the edge of town, exactly where he'd left her, and they stood together in the yard, looking at the home that suddenly felt more fragile than it had that morning. "He'll come," Cole said quietly. "I know. Tonight, maybe, or tomorrow. But he'll come." Ruth looked at the cabin, at the fence Cole had repaired, at the garden where green shoots were pushing through the earth. She'd built a life here from nothing, had survived loss that should have killed her. She wasn't going to let it be taken now. "Then we'll be ready," she said. They spent the evening preparing. Cole checked every window, every door, every approach to the house. Ruth loaded weapons, the rifle, the revolvers, the old shotgun that had belonged to her father. They set lanterns in strategic places, filled buckets with water, moved anything flammable away from the walls. As darkness fell, they sat together at the table, a single candle burning between them. Neither had much appetite, but Ruth had made coffee, strong and bitter, and they drank it in silence. "I'm sorry," Cole said finally, "for leaving, for making you come after me." Ruth's hands wrapped around her cup. "Don't apologize for trying to protect me. I should have known you'd follow. You should have." She looked at him across the candlelight. "I'm not some fragile thing that breaks at the first sign of trouble, Cole. I've been breaking and putting myself back together for years. I know what I can survive. I just didn't want you to have to. That's not your choice to make." He nodded slowly. "No, I suppose it's not." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what was coming pressing down like a physical thing. "If we survive this," Cole said, his voice low, "I'd like to stay. If you'll have me." Ruth's heart stuttered. "Stay? Work the land. Fix what needs fixing. Build something that lasts." He paused, his eyes finding hers. "With you." She wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to reach across the table and take his hand and promise him everything. But the words caught in her throat, tangled with fear and hope, and the knowledge that tomorrow might steal this moment before it could become real. "Ask me again when the sun comes up," she said quietly. "I will." The night stretched on. They took turns keeping watch, one sleeping while the other sat by the window, rifle across their lap. But neither slept deeply. Every sound made them tense, every shift of wind or creak of wood. Dawn came slowly, reluctant, as if it knew what it was bringing. Ruth woke to find Cole standing at the window, his body silhouetted against the pale light. She rose and moved beside him, following his gaze. Riders, at least 15 of them, maybe more. They came from the east, moving slow and purposeful, a dark line against the brightening sky. "He brought everyone," Cole said. Ruth's stomach tightened. "Can we hold them?" "I don't know." She picked up the rifle and checked the chamber for the 100th time. Her hands were steady now, her fear burned away by something harder, resolve. "Then we try anyway," she said. The riders stopped at the edge of the property just as they had days before, but this time there was no negotiation in their posture. They'd come for blood. Gaines rode at the front, his face hard as stone. Taggart was beside him, and behind them men Ruth didn't recognize. Hired guns by the look of them. Men who killed for money and asked no questions. Cole stepped onto the porch, his rifle held ready. Ruth stood beside him, her own weapon raised. "That's far enough," Cole called out. Gaines pulled his horse to a stop. "You made a fool of me yesterday, Brennan. In front of the whole town. You made a fool of yourself. I just gave people permission to see it." Noble words from a dead man. "I'm still breathing. Not for long." Gaines' eyes shifted to Ruth. "Last chance, ma'am. Walk away now and you live. Stay and you burn with him. Then I'll burn," Ruth said. Something flickered in Gaines' expression. Surprise, maybe, or grudging respect. Then it hardened again. "So be it." He raised his hand, and the riders began to spread out, forming a semicircle around the house. They were positioning for a siege, cutting off any escape. Cole's jaw tightened. "Get inside." "I'm not Ruth." "Inside. Now." The sharpness in his voice made her move. She backed through the door, rifle still raised, and Cole followed, slamming it shut and dropping the bar across. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the walls thinner. Through the windows Ruth could see the riders dismounting, taking cover behind the fence posts and trees. They were settling in, preparing for a long fight. "They're not rushing us," Cole said, moving to the window. "They're going to wait us out, wear us down. How long can we hold?" "Depends on how patient they are." A shot rang out, splintering the window frame inches from Cole's head. He ducked back, cursing, and returned fire. The sound was deafening in the small space, the smell of gunpowder thick and acrid. More shots followed, a steady barrage that punched holes in the walls and shattered glass. Ruth dropped to the floor and crawled to the other window, returning fire when she had a target. But the riders were smart, keeping low, using cover. The siege had begun. For hours, they fought. The sun climbed higher, turning the cabin into an oven. Sweat soaked through their clothes. Their ears rang from the constant gunfire. Bullets tore through the walls, sending splinters flying. One grazed Ruth's arm, a hotline of pain that she barely registered. Cole reloaded with mechanical precision, his face grim. "We're running low on ammunition." Ruth checked her own supply. 8 bullets left, maybe 10 in the rifle. Not enough. Not nearly enough. "What do we do?" she asked. "We make every shot count." Another volley of gunfire. Another window shattered. Ruth fired back, saw a man duck behind the fence, missed, and then, through the chaos, she heard it, the crackle of flames. Cole's head snapped toward the back of the cabin. "They're burning us out." Smoke began seeping through the gaps in the walls, thin at first, then thicker. The smell was sharp and terrible. Ruth's eyes watered, her lungs burned. "We have to go," Cole said, coughing. "If we stay, we die. If we go out there, we die anyway. Maybe, but at least we'll die fighting." He grabbed her hand, his eyes fierce and determined. Together? Ruth looked at him. This man who'd ridden into her life half dead, who'd worked her land and made her laugh and given her something to fight for. And she realized she'd already made her choice weeks ago. "Together," she said. They moved to the front door. Cole dropped the bar and kicked it open. Smoke poured out, thick and black. They burst through, rifles raised, firing as they ran. The riders scattered, surprised by the sudden attack. Ruth shot a man reaching for his gun. Cole dropped another. They ran for the barn, bullets kicking up dirt at their heels. They made it inside and slammed the door, gasping for breath. The barn was darker, cooler, but it wouldn't hold long. Through the gaps in the walls, Ruth could see the riders regrouping. "We need to get to the horses," Cole said. "If we can ride out, there's only one horse." "Then you take her." "No, Ruth, no." She grabbed his shirt, her eyes fierce. "I'm not leaving you. Not now, not ever." He stared at her, something breaking open in his expression. Then he pulled her close and kissed her, hard and desperate and full of everything they hadn't said. When they pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers. "I love you," he said. "I should have said it before. Say it again when this is over." "I will." A sound outside made them freeze. Footsteps, voices. The riders were closing in. Cole moved to the door, peering through a gap. "They're coming from all sides. We're trapped." Ruth looked around the barn, searching for anything they could use. And then she saw it. The hay stacked in the corner, the oil lantern hanging on the wall, the loose boards overhead. An idea formed, desperate and dangerous. "Can you get to the roof?" she asked. Cole looked up at the rafters. "Maybe." "Why?" "Because we're not going to wait for them to come to us. We're going to make them scatter." She grabbed the lantern and smashed it against the hay. Flames caught immediately, spreading fast. Smoke began to billow, thick and black, pouring through the gaps in the walls. "What are you doing?" Cole demanded. "Creating a diversion. Now climb." He hesitated, then scrambled up the ladder to the loft. Ruth followed, the flames already licking at the walls below. The heat was intense, suffocating. They kicked out the loose boards in the roof and pulled themselves through. The riders outside shouted, confusion rippling through their ranks. Smoke poured from the barn, and flames began to show through the walls. They backed away, uncertain, thinking Cole and Ruth were still inside. But they were on the roof, rifles raised. Ruth fired first, picking off a rider who'd turned his back. Cole followed, his shots deliberate and precise. The riders scattered, diving for cover, their carefully planned siege falling apart. And then, through the smoke and chaos, Ruth heard something that made her heart leap, hoofbeats. Lots of them, coming fast. From the west, a group of riders emerged. The rancher from town, the old sheriff who'd thrown down his badge, and a dozen others. Townspeople, people who'd stayed silent too long and decided enough was enough. They rode into the yard with rifles raised, and the fight turned. Gaines's men, caught between the burning barn and the new arrivals, broke. Some ran, some surrendered. Taggart tried to rally them, but a shot from the old sheriff dropped him before he could finish shouting. Gaines himself sat on his horse, watching his empire crumble. His face was white with rage and disbelief. The rancher rode up to him, rifle leveled. "It's over, Gaines. You're done." For a moment it looked like Gaines might fight. His hand moved toward his gun. But then he saw the faces around him. People he'd bullied, threatened, stolen from. People who'd finally found their courage. He lowered his hand. "Tie him up," the rancher said. "We're taking him back to town. Let a judge decide what happens next." As Gaines was dragged from his horse, the barn collapsed behind them, sending up a column of sparks and smoke. Ruth and Cole climbed down from the roof, coughing and singed, but alive. The rancher dismounted and walked over. "Heard what happened yesterday. Figured you might need help." Cole gripped his hand. "You figured right." The man smiled. "That woman of yours has more spine than half the men in this valley. You better hold on to her." Cole looked at Ruth, his eyes warm despite the soot and blood. "I intend to." By evening the riders were gone, Gaines bound and headed for trial. The townspeople helped put out the last of the flames, though the barn was lost. The cabin had survived, scorched but standing. Ruth and Cole stood in the yard, watching the sun set over the valley. The air still smelled of smoke, and their bodies ached with exhaustion. But they were alive. "Ask me again," Ruth said quietly. Cole turned to her. "What?" "What you asked me last night. Ask me again." He took her hands, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Will you let me stay? Will you let me work this land with you, build something that lasts?" Ruth looked at him. This man who'd fought beside her, who'd been willing to die for her, who'd given her back the will to live. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." He smiled, truly smiled, and pulled her into his arms. They stood there as the light faded, holding each other. Two people who'd survived the fire and found each other in the ashes. The land stretched out before them, scarred but healing. And somewhere in the fading light, Ruth thought she heard the whisper of forgiveness, for the past, for the pain, for all the years she'd spent just surviving instead of living. Tomorrow they would rebuild. Tomorrow they would begin again. But tonight they simply held each other and let the peace settle in. And when spring finally came, it didn't just thaw the land. It thawed two hearts that had once been frozen by fear. The first wildflowers appeared 3 weeks after the fire. Small purple blooms pushing through the ash-darkened soil where the barn had stood, delicate and stubborn, refusing to be buried by what had burned. Ruth knelt beside them one morning, her fingers brushing the soft petals, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite joy, but the memory of it, the promise that it could return. Behind her, the sound of hammering echoed across the valley. Cole was rebuilding the barn, board by board, the frame rising slow and steady against the pale spring sky. Other men had come to help. The rancher from town, his 2 sons, even the old sheriff who'd thrown down his badge. They worked without asking for payment, without expecting anything except the knowledge that they were setting something right. Ruth stood and walked toward them, carrying a bucket of water and tin cups. The men paused in their work, wiping sweat from their faces, their hands rough and calloused. Cole climbed down from the frame and took a cup, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth that still made her breath catch. "Coming along," she said, nodding toward the barn. "Be finished by week's end if the weather holds." The rancher drained his cup and wiped his mouth. "You've got good land here, ma'am. Shame it went so long without proper care." Ruth bristled slightly, but Cole put a hand on her shoulder. "She's done more than most could, alone as she's been." The rancher had the grace to look embarrassed. "Didn't mean offense, just saying it's good to see it worked proper again." "No offense taken," Ruth said, though her voice was cool. "And I appreciate the help." When the men returned to work, Cole lingered. "You all right?" "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." She turned to face him fully. "I've kept this place alive for 5 years without help from anyone. I know he didn't mean harm, but I won't have people thinking I couldn't manage." Cole's expression softened. "No one thinks that, Ruth. They see what you did. They see your strength. That's why they're here, because you showed them what courage looks like." She looked away, her jaw tight. But after a moment, she nodded. "I suppose." He kissed her forehead, quick and gentle. "Come on. Let me show you something." He led her around the side of the house to where the garden spread out, twice the size it had been. Fresh soil had been turned, neat rows marked with string and stakes. Seeds she didn't remember buying had been planted. Beans and squash, carrots and corn. "When did you do this?" she asked. "Been working on it before sunrise. Wanted it to be a surprise." Ruth walked between the rows, her hand trailing over the disturbed earth. "This is too much for just the 2 of us. Maybe we'll have more mouths to feed someday." She stopped, her heart suddenly pounding. When she turned, Cole was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, hope and fear mixed together. "Cole, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "Just saying, the future doesn't have to look like the past. Ruth's throat tightened. She'd buried that future years ago, laid it in the ground beside her son and her husband and every dream she'd let die. But standing here, looking at the garden Cole had planted, she felt something stir, a fragile, terrifying possibility. "One day at a time," she said quietly. He nodded. One day at a time. That evening, after the workers had gone and the sun hung low over the western ridge, Ruth and Cole sat on the new porch steps he'd built. The old ones had been burned in the fire, charred and unstable. These were sturdy, the wood still pale and unseasoned, smelling of pine sap and promise. Cole was carving again, his knife moving in slow, careful strokes. The bird he'd been working on for months was nearly finished now, wings spread, beak open, caught in the moment before flight. "It's beautiful," Ruth said. "It's for you." She looked at him surprised. "Cole, I want you to have it." A reminder that broken things can still fly. Her eyes stung. She took the carving, running her fingers over the smooth wood, feeling the care in every detail. "Thank you." They sat in silence as the light faded, the valley settling into twilight. A cool breeze carried the scent of wild sage and new grass. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, lonely and clear. "Do you ever think about going back?" Ruth asked. "To wherever you came from before all this?" Cole was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes. But there's nothing there for me now. That life ended the day I rode into this valley. Do you regret it?" "No." He looked at her, his eyes steady. "I regret a lot of things, Ruth. But finding you isn't one of them." She leaned against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her. They sat together as the stars began to appear, small lights in the vast darkness, each one a reminder that beauty could exist even in the deepest night. By the end of the month, the barn was finished. The men had a small celebration. Nothing fancy, just coffee and cornbread, a few words spoken about community and second chances. The old sheriff made a short speech about how the valley was changing, how people were standing up for what was right instead of looking away. "We lost our way for a while," he said, his voice rough with age and regret. "Let men like Gaines run roughshod because it was easier than fighting. But you two," he nodded at Ruth and Cole, "you reminded us what it means to stand firm, to face the storm instead of hiding from it." Ruth felt her cheeks warm. She wasn't used to being seen, wasn't comfortable with praise. But Cole squeezed her hand, and she managed a small smile. After everyone had gone, they walked through the new barn together. It smelled of fresh-cut lumber and sawdust. The stalls were clean and ready. The loft was sturdy, the ladder firmly anchored. "We'll need animals to fill it," Cole said. "Chickens aren't enough." He smiled. "I was thinking more along the lines of a milk cow, maybe a couple of pigs. And horses, eventually. That's a lot of work. Good thing there's two of us now." Ruth looked around the empty barn, imagining it full of life. Animals moving in their stalls, hay stacked high in the loft, the sounds of a working ranch. It had been so long since she'd let herself imagine anything beyond simple survival. "All right," she said, "let's start with the cow." They bought her the following week, a gentle brown Jersey with soft eyes and a patient temperament. Cole built a small shed for milking, and Ruth learned to work her hands into the rhythm of it, the warm milk streaming into the pail, the cow's steady breathing, the quiet satisfaction of productive work. Children from town began to visit. At first, just one or two, drawn by stories of the siege, wanting to see the place where people had stood up to Samuel Gaines. Ruth was wary at first, uncomfortable with the attention. But Cole welcomed them, showed them how to feed the chickens, let them pet the cow. One girl, no more than 7, asked Ruth if she was scared during the fire. Ruth knelt down to the child's level. "Yes. I was terrified. But you did it anyway?" "Yes. Why?" Ruth thought about how to answer, how to explain something so complex to someone so young. Because sometimes the things worth having are on the other side of fear, and the only way to reach them is to walk through it. The girl nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. Then she ran off to chase the chickens, her braids bouncing. Cole came up beside Ruth. "You're good with them. I'm out of practice. Doesn't show." She watched the children playing in the yard, their laughter bright and clear. "Do you think about it, having children?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "I think about a lot of things these days. Things I never let myself consider before." "Like what?" "Like growing old somewhere, watching seasons turn, building something that lasts beyond myself." He looked at her. "Like family." Ruth's heart squeezed. "I don't know if I can do that again. Lose someone like that. You might not have to. You can't promise that." No, but I can promise I'll try. Every day I'll try. She turned to face him fully, her eyes searching his. What if I'm too broken? What if there's not enough left of me to build something new? Cole took her face in his hands, gentle and sure. Ruth, you're the strongest person I've ever met. You survived things that would have destroyed most people. You're not broken. You're forged. A tear slipped down her cheek, and he brushed it away with his thumb. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe alone. She kissed him then, there in the yard with the children playing and the sun warm on their shoulders. Kissed him like a promise, like a beginning, like the first green shoot pushing through winter soil. Summer came slow and gentle. The garden flourished, bursting with life. Ruth canned vegetables and made preserves, her cellar filling with jars that caught the light like jewels. Cole fixed the last of the fences and started work on a chicken coop that would protect the hens from foxes and weather. They worked side by side through the long days, their movements synchronized, their silences comfortable. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and watched the light fade, sometimes talking, sometimes just existing together in the quiet. One night, as the fireflies began their slow dance across the darkening yard, Ruth said, I want to try. Cole looked at her. Try what? Everything. The future, family, all of it. She took his hand. I want to try with you. His smile was slow and warm like sunrise. Yeah? Yeah. He pulled her close. And they sat together under the emerging stars, two people who'd found each other in the wreckage and decided to rebuild. By autumn, the valley had transformed. Word had spread about what happened at Ruth's place, about how ordinary people had stood up to a tyrant and won. Gaines had been tried and convicted, his land divided among the families he'd stolen from. Taggart and his men had scattered, disappearing into territories where their reputations hadn't yet caught up with them. The town was different now, more cautious perhaps, but also more awake. People looked each other in the eye. They helped when help was needed. They remembered what it cost to look away. Ruth and Cole were invited to a harvest dance in town. Ruth hadn't been to one in years, hadn't wanted to face the whispers and sideways glances. But things had changed. She had changed. She wore the dress she'd kept in the bottom of her trunk, the blue one her husband had liked. It still fit, though differently now. She was thinner, harder, but also somehow more substantial. Cole wore a clean shirt and combed his hair, looking younger than she'd ever seen him. They rode into town together in the wagon Cole had repaired, the evening air cool and sweet with the smell of harvested grain. Music drifted from the church hall, fiddles and guitars, someone singing a song Ruth remembered from childhood. Inside, people made room for them. The rancher's wife brought them punch. The old sheriff asked Ruth to dance, his movements stiff but earnest. Cole danced with the little girl who'd asked if Ruth was scared, spinning her until she shrieked with laughter. And when the slow song started, Cole found Ruth at the edge of the crowd and held out his hand. They danced in the warm glow of lantern light, surrounded by people who were becoming neighbors, becoming friends. Ruth rested her head against Cole's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For staying, for fighting, for showing me I could live again instead of just surviving. His arms tightened around her. You did that yourself. I just had the good sense to recognize it. They swayed together as the music wrapped around them, and Ruth felt something she hadn't felt in years, belonging. Not to a place, but to a moment, to a person, to a future that was no longer something to fear. Winter came gently that year, with snow that fell soft and steady, blanketing the valley in white. Ruth and Cole spent the cold months close to the fire, planning the spring planting, repairing tack and tools, reading aloud from the books Ruth had kept but never touched. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled warm, Ruth set down the letter she'd been writing, another one she'd never send, and looked at Cole across the table. I'm done, she said. He looked up from the harness he was mending. With what? With these. She gestured to the stack of letters in the drawer, with writing to ghosts, with living in the past. She stood and walked to the stove, opening the door. The flames leaped and danced, hungry for fuel. One by one she fed the letters to the fire, watching them curl and blacken and disappear. Cole watched silently, understanding without needing explanation. When the last letter was gone, Ruth closed the stove door and turned to him. I want to live here, now, with you. He stood and crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. Then that's what we'll do. They stood together in the warm cabin, holding each other as the wind sang outside and the fire burned steady. The past was ash now, gone but not forgotten, and the future stretched ahead, unknown but no longer frightening. Spring returned as it always did, faithful and patient. The wildflowers bloomed thick that year, carpeting the valley in purple and gold. Ruth's garden burst with life, and the animals grew fat and healthy. Children came often now, playing in the yard, learning to ride the gentle mare, helping with chores in exchange for stories and cookies. One afternoon, Ruth stood at the garden's edge, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, feeling the flutter of new life growing inside her. She hadn't told Cole yet, wanted to wait until she was sure, until the fear had settled into something closer to hope. But as she watched him working in the distance, mending a fence with the same careful patience he brought to everything, she knew it was time. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, she took his hand and placed it over her heart, then lower, over her belly. "We're going to need a bigger house," she said quietly. Cole went very still. His eyes found hers, wide and questioning. "Are you—" "Yes." His face transformed, joy breaking across it like dawn. He pulled her close, his hands shaking, his breath unsteady. "Ruth. God, Ruth. I'm scared," she admitted. "I know, so am I, but we'll face it together. Promise?" "Promise." They sat together as the light faded, Cole's hand never leaving her stomach, both of them quiet with wonder and fear and the staggering weight of hope. The seasons turned. Ruth's belly grew round. Cole built a cradle from wood he'd cut and dried himself. Each joint fitted perfectly, the surface smooth as glass. The women from town brought baby clothes and advice, their earlier judgment replaced by genuine warmth. And on a morning in late spring, when the valley was green and alive and bursting with new growth, Ruth gave birth to a daughter. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Ruth thought she might not survive it, when the pain was so overwhelming she wanted to surrender. But Cole was there, holding her hand, whispering encouragement, refusing to let her give up. When the baby finally came, red-faced and squalling, Ruth wept, not from pain, but from relief and joy and the overwhelming realization that she'd been given another chance. Cole held his daughter with shaking hands, his eyes wet, his voice breaking as he whispered, "She's perfect." They named her Hope, because that's what she was. Proof that broken things could heal, that joy could return after loss, that life could begin again even in the ashes. The valley stretched out before them, wide and forgiving, full of promise. The cabin stood strong, surrounded by gardens and animals, and the laughter of children who would grow up knowing that courage and kindness could change the world. Ruth stood on the porch one evening, Hope sleeping in her arms, and watched the sun sink below the hills. Cole came up beside her, his arm wrapping around her waist, and together they looked out over the land they'd fought for, the life they'd built, the future they'd dared to claim. "We did it," Ruth said softly. "Yeah, we did." The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and new grass. The sky turned gold, then pink, then the deep blue of coming night. And as the first stars appeared, Ruth felt a peace so profound it was almost painful. The land remembers mercy longer than it remembers sin. And here, in this valley, two people who'd been broken by life had found each other and built something beautiful from the fragments. They'd survived the storm, they'd faced the fire, they'd stood when others ran, and now, finally, they could rest, together. The camera pulls back slowly, the cabin growing smaller, the valley widening, until the whole world is visible, beautiful and scarred and full of endless possibility. The light fades, the stars emerge, and in the warm glow of the cabin window, two shadows move together, wrapped in the simple miracle of having survived, of having loved, of having dared to hope. The land remembers mercy longer than it remembers sin. And this land, this valley, this small corner of the world, would remember Ruth and Cole forever, not as victims or outlaws or broken people, but as two souls who chose to heal, to fight, to love, who chose, against all odds, to live.